Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Young Ki-hong. I am a senior associate at Scar Legal PC. Today we are going to spend some time talking about TM Visa's sponsorship and requirements. And we are very lucky to have our firm's another senior associate, Dustin Saldariaga, as a speaker for this webinar. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are full service immigration law firm and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, any types of employment-based or family-based green card cases, and more. And that said, we are especially well known for our work with the TM visas. And we have built a very strong reputation in this area. We have processed hundreds of TM visas. Many of them were complicated cases and successfully ended with our dedicated works and have worked with many employers who did not have any experience with the TM visa processes. So you can trust us for our experience and depth knowledge about it. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools, a copy of the PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, and a link where you can download the guides with more details on visa options, and link to sign up for additional webinars. Also, a link to webinar recording on YouTube. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration-related videos. And another link where you can set up a consultation with us. So finally, for any questions, please type them into the chat box or in the Q&A box, and we'll address all the questions at the end of presentations. And with that, I will hand it over to Dustin to get us started.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Anki. And thank you all for joining us for our presentation on the TN visa. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So the TN visa, the first thing that's important to know about the TN visa is that it was created originally through NAFTA. So it is an agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And the idea behind it was basically to streamline and make easier the process for workers between those three countries to work in those different countries. So if you have a passport from Mexico or Canada, and you have a job offer in the US and you're looking to come here to work in a specific profession, we'll go over which professions are covered, then the TN visa may well be the easiest option for you. When a national of Canada or Mexico comes to our firm and says, I'm looking to work in the US, the TN visa is going to probably be the first or the second option that we talk with that individual about, because it is just so straightforward, so fast, so easy, especially for nationals of Canada. Also for nationals of Mexico, but we'll talk about why for nationals of Canada, it's particularly easy. So let's get started talking about what the specific TN requirements are. As I mentioned, you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. Now, what that means is you need to have a passport from Canada or Mexico. You don't need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. And we've helped plenty of individuals who were, for example, born in India or in China, who later naturalized and became citizens of Canada, for example, who then applied for TN visas. And that's perfectly fine. As long as you have a passport from Canada or Mexico, you meet this requirement for the TN visa. Now, second of all, you need to be coming to the US to work in one of the listed professions. Now, when I say one of the listed professions, what does that mean? If you're at your computer, this is a good time to hop on Google and just put into Google NAFTA TN regulations and pull up the link. I like the Cornell Law School regulations. But basically, the reason that I'm encouraging you to do this, we don't usually recommend that our clients pull up, the statute or the regulations, but for the TN, it actually is important because the TN regulations are, first of all, quite easy to understand. But second of all, they are very specific and helpful in terms of how to qualify for the visa. So when I say one of the listed professions, if you're looking at the TN regulations and you scroll down them, you will come across a list of professions. It starts with accountant, the next is architect, computer systems analyst. There are dozens of listed professions. Lawyers are on the list, management consultants. There are a number of professions in the medical and allied field, scientists, college, seminary, or university teachers. So really, there are dozens of professions that are listed. Now, there are many professions that are not listed, and we'll talk about a few of those later in the presentation. But for now, what's important to know is that you do need to be coming to the US to work in one of these listed professions. The next requirement that you see is you must have the required qualifications to practice that profession. So what that means is not what the employer wants you to have. So if you may find an employer in the US who's looking for an economist with 20 years of experience as an economist. That's not what I mean by qualification. What I mean by qualification is again, what the regulations say. So let's stick with that example of an economist. If we look at economist in the TN regulations, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So that is the only way that you can qualify as an economist under the TN regulations. So if you get a job offer to work as an economist in the US, you do need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree to qualify for that. All right, so you need a passport from Canada or Mexico. You need to be coming to the US to work in one of the listed professions, and you need to qualify for that profession. And keep in mind that each of the listed professions does have its own qualifications. So economist, we mentioned you need that degree. What about accountants? You need a degree or a professional license. If we look at management consultants, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, you can qualify based on a degree or equivalent professional experience amounting to essentially 5 years of experience in the field or 5 years of experience as a management consultant. So the management consulting category, just to give you a glimpse into what we'll talk about later in the presentation, does allow you to qualify based on experience alone. It is one of the only TN professions that allows you to qualify based on experience alone. Pretty much every other profession on the list is going to require either a degree or a professional license. And oftentimes for that professional license, you'll need a degree. But on this qualification piece, it is important to just focus on the regulations. So if you are coming to the US in a specific profession, look at the regulations, and in your TN application, you'll just make it clear, I qualify for this profession because I have the degree, or I have the professional license, or if you can qualify based on experience, you have that experience. And again, we'll talk more about what it looks like to do that and what evidence you'd include to prove that. So the next requirement you see on your screen, you must have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. So what that means is basically you need a job offer. The TN visa is not a visa to use to look for a job in the US. So you can't apply for a TN visa saying, hey, I have a PhD in economics and I want to come to the US on a TN to find a job. You will not be approved. You do need to already have that job offer from a US employer. Now, fortunately, the regulations define what an employer is very broadly. So an employer needs to basically be any employer in the United States. It could be a sole proprietorship. It could even be a single person who runs a business. So to give you an example, it could be, say, an accountant who is just one person who runs an accounting firm and they run it, say, as a sole proprietorship, if that's allowed in their state. That would count as an employer. Could be an LLC in the US, could be a corporation in the US, but the definition of an employer is very broad. The limitation on this is that you as the TN applicant cannot be the primary owner of the US company. So let's say that you are a national of Canada, you're getting your accounting degree in the US on an F1 visa, and you decide that you want to work for that accounting firm as a TN accountant. That's not going to be allowed if you own that accounting firm, or if you have control over the accounting firm. In contrast, if you're getting that accounting degree and say KPMG, a large US company, wants to employ you as an accountant, that may very well work for a TN because, again, you have a US employer. They're looking to employ you. You don't own the US employer. And assuming you qualify for the accounting role, that could work very well. So next on the list you see is that in the job you're coming to the US to fill, you need to be employed to engage in professional activities that are consistent with that profession. So this might sound intuitive. It might sound like it makes sense, but it actually does come up quite a bit. And let me just give you an example why. Let's say that you have a degree in economics, and an employer in the US wants to hire you to handle their social media and their marketing. And they say, hey, you know what? We'd love to have an accountant. I mean, sorry, an economist. You're good at analyzing numbers. You can write well. We want to hire you to basically run our social media. You might say, okay, great. I'm going to get a TN visa as an economist, but when I come into the US, I'm going to be running this social media for this company. That's going to be a problem. And it's going to be a problem because the first thing that the US government is going to say is, okay, what are you actually going to be doing in the US? And are you going to be working as an economist? And if you say I'm doing social media work, that's not going to qualify. How do you know if certain job duties qualify? Well, I'm going to recommend the second resource, which again, if you're at your computer, is worth looking at real quick. The first was the TN regulations. The second is the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or the OOH. So if you Google OOH, and let's just put in economist since we're using that example. One of the first links you see should be the economist link to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And if you click that link and then you see some tabs at the top of your screen, click on the tab that says what they do. And you see a list of job duties. And a headline that says what economists do. So the Occupational Outlook Handbook is a publication of the US government. It's published by the US Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this is what the government thinks that a profession does. So I've pulled up economists. If you're on the same page, you see economists typically do the following. They research economic issues, they conduct surveys, they collect data, they analyze data using mathematical models, statistical tools, they interpret and forecast trends, they advise businesses, governments, and individuals on fiscal policy or other economic topics, and they present their research. So if you are coming to the US to manage a social media campaign, that's not going to fall under these job duties, and that's going to be your problem. So if you're coming to the US to work as an economist, make sure you're coming to the US to perform these job duties. Now, you don't have to, in the application, you don't have to copy and paste these job duties, but the job duties need to be aligned. And if they're not, it is worth working with your US employer to say, hey, if you want me to work for your company, the government's going to require that I perform job duties that are aligned with these. So is it possible to make sure my job duties are aligned? If you do want to work with our firm, we will regularly work with the employer to make sure that the job duties are aligned. Um, if you want to do it on your own, of course, you are free to do that. But the important thing to know is that the government is going to look at the Occupational Outlook Handbook for your specific profession and make sure that your job duties are aligned with what is in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. the last item on your screen that you see is that your degree must match the job description, and specifically the degree must match the profession. So what does that mean? That means I said before, and let's stick with the economist example, because the only way you can qualify as an economist is, again, if you have a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. But it doesn't end there, because you cannot have just any degree. Let's say you're applying as an economist with a degree in Spanish. That's going to be a problem, because the government is going to want to see that your degree is related to the profession. So ideally, you'll have a bachelor's degree in economics. But what if you have a degree in, say, finance or in math or in statistics? You see how there is a spectrum where ideally they want to see a degree in economics. It would be bad if you had a degree, say, in Spanish, English, French, if the degree is clearly not related to the profession. But there are, you know, subjects in between that are more closely related to economics, such as finance, math, statistics, etc. What you want to do is, if your degree is not explicitly aligned, so say economics, if your degree is, say, math, finance, or even English or French, if you took a lot of classes in economics, then you can include your transcript from college, and you can bring your transcript to your interview and make it clear what classes you took and that your coursework prepared you for a career in economics. If you really, what we've done in the past for clients in this situation, you can get letters from the university, you can get letters from advisors. Say you studied French, but you did significant independent research in economics, or somehow you wrote a thesis on a topic related to economics. You may make the argument in the application that even though I have a degree in French, I have the background and the coursework that qualifies me to work as an economist. You may need a letter from your university attesting to that. But the takeaway from this is the government wants to see your degree is related. If your degree is not related, it's an opportunity for you to advocate for yourself. We do help clients with this. Would be happy to help you if that's relevant to you. All right, we can go to the next slide. So you see the Occupational Outlook Handbook on your screen. This is an example. The example you are looking at is for economists, which we've been talking about. The one thing that's related to what we've been talking about that I want to quickly note, when we're talking about related degrees, one of the things that's really helpful on the Occupational Outlook Handbook is another tab, not the What They Do tab, but the How to Become One tab. If you click that tab, you'll see How to Become an Economist. So you see, give me just a second. Okay. Under education, you will see economists typically need a master's degree. That it's okay. Don't worry if you have a bachelor's, because the TN regulations make it clear you qualify based on a master's. But the reason that I'm looking at this is the second paragraph here. To pursue an advanced degree in economics, program applicants may need to have completed undergraduate coursework in subjects such as economics or mathematics. And candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or mathematics may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. So this is just a helpful thing to cite, to point to, if you have a related degree. So let's say you have a degree in math or a degree in statistics, and you're trying to make the argument that your degree is relevant to an economist role. One of the first things you would want to point to is the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and quote this language and say, hey, the Occupational Outlook Handbook says that candidates who have a bachelor's degree with course credits in statistics or math may qualify. So that's going to be really helpful for you. I'm using the example of economists, but you'd want to do this for any profession that you're applying for if you have a related degree. The Occupational Outlook Handbook really is a very, can be a very helpful resource to you. So we can go to the next slide. This next slide is addressing one of the most common questions we get, which is, does a TN visa require sponsorship? And the reason that this is a common question is that many roles in, or many green cards, many non-immigrant work visas, such as the H-1B, do require something that is called sponsorship. So what does sponsorship mean in the context of US immigration? Really, sponsorship is a number of requirements that apply to a US employer. Um, and I'll quickly say they do not apply to a TN employer. So just to get the answer out of the way, we would say that a TN visa does not require sponsorship. So let me explain why that is. Sponsorship in US immigration usually means that a US employer that wants to hire a foreign worker, say for a green card or for an H-1B, needs to test the US labor market. They need to advertise the job. They need to make sure that they are paying a prevailing wage, which is typically higher than minimum wage. They need to make sure that there's no available and qualified US worker for the job. If there is a qualified US worker who wants to take the job, then the US employer needs to offer the job to that person rather than to the foreign national. There are other requirements, such as if the job ends, the US company may need to pay for the worker to go back home. There may be an obligation that the US employer actively employ the worker. So this is called benching in the H-1B context when an employee comes to the US and is not given work. There are a lot of requirements on a US employer who sponsors a foreign national. So if they want to hire someone as an H-1B, if they want to hire someone as an EB-3, a green card, third preference category, or even an EB-2, they would need to satisfy a lot of these requirements. The TN does not require any of this. So what is a TN employer required to do? Essentially, a TN employer is required to do for the foreign national exactly what they would need to do for any worker. So what does that mean? They would need to make a job offer. They would need to put that job offer in writing. They would need to sign a letter that says the role that they want to employ the foreign national in, how much they plan to pay them, for what period of time, up to 3 years, which is the period for a TN visa, max period, when they enter the US. Also, why the company needs someone in this position. But the foreign national, once they're hired, they're an at-will employee. So they can quit if they want. They can be fired if the company's not happy with their performance. Um, the Really, there are no additional obligations on the US company beyond what obligations would apply to any other worker, meaning the US company would need to pay minimum wage if that applies, but they're not required to test the labor market. They don't need to see if there's another qualified US worker willing to take the role. They don't need to pay a prevailing wage, only minimum wage. They don't need to pay for the worker to go back to their home country if work is terminated. So really, there is no sponsorship required of the U.S. employer for a TN worker. Now, one quick caveat to this is if the TN applicant is inside the U.S., say they are in F1 student status and they are trying to change status to TN status, um, then it is the employer that would sign the application, the I-129, which would go to USCIS. So technically, it is the employer that submits that application. If the application is denied, it is the employer's application that is denied. But even that does not create additional obligations on the employer beyond what I described before. Um, if the TN applicant's applying at a port of entry or at a consulate, then it is the employee, the applicant who's presenting the application, not the employer. So that's a distinction between applying at USCIS from within the US, which is done by the employer, or applying at a consulate or a port of entry, which is done by the employee applicant. Um, we'll talk more about the specifics and the procedures for applying in a later slide. But for now, um, the important takeaway from this slide is that TN employers, again, this is part of why the TN visa is so popular. It is fast. It does not create significant obligations on the part of either the employee or the employer, and certainly does not require sponsorship. So we can go on. So going to the practical and procedural aspects of a TN application that I mentioned before, um, nationals of Canada and Mexico can apply for a TN visa. You just need a passport from one of those two countries to apply for a TN visa. But the process of applying is different for nationals of Canada and Mexico. To really simplify this, nationals of Canada have several options to apply for a TN visa. One, they can apply at a consulate. Two, they can apply at a port of entry. And three, they can apply from within the US through USCIS. Nationals of Mexico only have two of those options available. They cannot apply at a port of entry, so they can apply at a consulate, and if they're in the US, they can apply for a change of status to TN status. So only Canadians can apply at a port of entry. That is the big difference between the process for Canadians and Mexicans. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Nationals of Canada almost always will apply at a port of entry. And the reason for that is applying at a port of entry is extremely fast. You get an instant decision, and if you are approved, you're allowed into the US in TN status. So it's immediate. If you are allowed into the US, typically you're given TN status for 3 years. That could be limited. It could be limited by either the Customs and Border Protection officer thinking it should be limited. Let's say you're coming into the US as a management consultant and you only ask for a year, which can be a strategic decision. We'll talk about that in a bit. But if you only ask for a year, they're going to grant you a year max. They may also have doubts about the role and say, look, I'll let you in for a year. I'm not going to let you in for 3 years. So you have a year to do this and then come back and apply again. They may limit it for that reason. They may also limit it if your passport's expiring. So if your passport's expiring in a year, they're probably not going to give you TN status for 3 years. But anyway, typically you would be given 3 years of status once you enter the US. And that basically means that you have a TN visa for 3 years. I use air quotes because Canadians are visa exempt. So you're not going to actually have a TN visa in your passport, but you typically will have a TN stamp in your passport that will state the period for which you have TN status. Now, for nationals of Canada, what is important to know is that only nationals of Canada can apply to port of entry, which means if your spouse or your children do not have passports from Canada, they would need to apply at a consulate. So for that reason, if the Canadian principal, the TN applicant, does have a spouse or children who don't have a Canadian passport, then the principal will typically join them at the consulate and apply that way. And if you do that, it's a very similar process in terms of the application materials. You would just submit a DS-160 online to the consulate. You'd be called in for an interview. You would go to the interview with your dependents, your spouse, your children. You would answer any questions they have. And then at the end of it, you would get your TN visa in your passport and you'd be able to enter the US. Real quick, you see TD, dependent visa stamp on your screen for dependents. That's what your spouse or children will get, is not a TN visa, they get a TD visa. That does allow them to study in the US. It does not allow them to work in the US, but it does allow them to join you and to study. So let's talk a bit about nationals of Mexico. Nationals of Mexico cannot apply at a port of entry. If they're outside the US, they must apply at a US consulate. So as I mentioned, the process is the same as Canadians applying at a consulate. You would first submit a DS-160 online to the consulate. And then when you would be offered an interview date, you'd go to your interview, answer any questions, and then you get the visa in your passport. Once you have the visa, you can enter the US in TN status. And The nice thing for nationals of Mexico is that they have the option to get a 4-year TN visa. So they do have to pay extra for that 4-year visa, but generally it's recommended to get the 4-year visa rather than the 2-year visa, um, because it's just so much more convenient. Now, regardless of whether you have a 2-year visa or a 4-year visa, when you enter the US, you're usually going to be given 3 years of TN status. And this does get a little confusing. I understand it's confusing, but basically a visa is a ticket that allows you to ask to be admitted into the US. So it gives you the ability to ask Customs and Border Protection to let you into the US. So as long as your visa is valid, you can ask to be allowed into the US. Once you're in the US, your visa does not matter. What matters is your I-94. Your I-94 explains how long you can be in the US. And again, the I-94 is typically issued for 3 years. You'll usually get 3 years of TN status. So just to take an extreme example, let's say that you're a national of Mexico, you get a 4-year TN visa, and you, on the very last day that your visa is valid, you seek entry into the US, you arrive at the border crossing. CBP should let you in because your visa is valid, even though it's valid for a day, that should be fine. And when you enter, they should give you 3 years of status, assuming, there's not a reason to give you less status, a shorter period of status. So even on the last day of your visa, you can enter the US and get 3 years of TN status. Now, if you leave the US in that 3-year period, you will not have a visa to come back in. So you would need to go to the consulate if you're a national of Mexico and apply for another TN visa. Or if you're a national of Canada, you need to prepare your materials and apply for a new TN visa when you enter the US through the land crossing or an airport if you fly. But that's the difference between the visa and the I-94 and status. Finally, for nationals of Mexico, if you do have a TN visa and it's expiring, you need to renew it. Sometimes the consulates in Mexico will allow you to renew through mail. You do need to physically be in Mexico, but you do not need to go to the visa interview if they offer you that option. So that can be very convenient for people. And basically, you'll submit the application and then the consulate will let you know if you qualify. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit and we're going to talk about some uniquely challenging TN professional categories. So if you remember, I had recommended that you pull up the TN regulations. Again, if you haven't done that, go to Google, search for TN NAFTA regulations, and you'll see there, again, dozens of professions. So some of these professions are more challenging than others to get approved by CBP. And the one that is probably most challenging is management consultants. And the reason this is challenging is, that, again, this is one of the only professional categories that does not require a degree. You can qualify as a management consultant based solely on experience. CBP, the government knows that, consulates know that. And they know that for nationals of Canada or Mexico that don't have a degree, they're probably just going to apply as a management consultant, whether or not they qualify, because management consultant is going to be the only category they can apply for based on experience. So management consultant applications are heavily scrutinized. I want to quickly say that not all management consultant applications, TN applications, are risky. There is a spectrum again. The safest management consultant application is one where the applicant is coming to the US to work as a management consultant at a management consulting firm. So if you are a national of Mexico and you've been working, say, at McKinsey in Mexico, and McKinsey wants to send you to a work site in the US, say you're going to be working for McKinsey in New York City on a TN visa, that is not a risky application, assuming that you have the degree and or the experience. If you're coming to work for a management consulting firm in the US, that is a standard TN application. It is not inherently risky. What is risky is when you're coming to the US to work for a company that is not a management consulting company. Those applications tend to be very heavily scrutinized. And just to give you an example of this, an example I like to use is, let's say that there is a national of Mexico who has been working in the solar panel industry for decades. And they are an expert in their field. They are very good at designing solar panels. They're very good at the manufacturing process for solar panels. And they are contacted by a US solar panel company that wants to hire them to improve that US company's manufacturing process for solar panels. That would be a risky application. And the reason is that this is a solar panel company in the US. It's not a management consulting company. Now, that being said, this example can certainly be approved. It is approvable. It's just that it is higher risk. So how would you strengthen this application? Really, what you want to do is you want to the application, the TN application, to make it very clear that this is in fact a management consulting role. What does that mean? When you think about the way that companies use management consultants, these are usually temporary engagements where a management consultant is being hired, usually not as a W-2 employee, they're being hired as a contractor typically, to come in for a limited period of time, say 6 months, a year, to address a very specific problem. So in the example I gave you, the problem is our US company is struggling to make our manufacturing of solar panels more efficient or more cost effective. And we have found a national in Mexico who is going to help us with that specific challenge. They're going to be here not for 3 years, not for 2 years. They're only going to be here long enough to address that challenge. We think it's a year. And we're going to pay them as a contractor based on the deliverables. So for the first 6 months, or say the first 3 months, they are going to analyze our chain of manufacturing. They are then going to spend a few months using those numbers and creating recommendations to improve our system. They're going to present those recommendations to management. And then the next phase of their engagement is going to be actually watching the implementation of those recommendations and seeing how that plays out at the company. And they're going to be paid based on those deliverables. That looks like a management consultant arrangement. Okay, so independent contractor agreement, management, you have an actual contract that's paying them based on deliverables, and that clearly defines the deliverables. It's for a temporary period of time to address a very specific challenge. Contrast that to what is oftentimes denied and is a high risk management consultant application, where a management consultant, someone is applying to come to the US as a TN management consultant to fill a role that's permanent at the company. So just to give you a contrasting example, a US company is hiring a national of Mexico to come in to fill basically a marketing manager role at the company. It's going to be a W-2 paid employee role. And basically, this person is really good at social media, and they're going to come to our company to work 40 hours a week for 3 years to work on our marketing. That looks a lot more like a permanent position at the company. And that is going to be very high risk because it doesn't look like a management consulting agreement. That being said, you can have someone working as a management consultant to work on your marketing. You just want to make sure that it is a legitimate consulting arrangement. And again, when I say the application needs to say something or needs to present something, that needs to be reality. So it's not enough for the application to say, this is a management consulting agreement. They're going to be an independent contractor. They're only going to be, paid based on these deliverables. That needs to actually happen when the person comes into the US. So these applications need to be honest. They need to be accurate. So do make sure in this management consulting category, you actually have someone coming to the US to work as a consultant, addressing a discrete challenge at your company. You see on your screen this word supernumerary. So it's this bullet. Unless the applicant's coming to work for a management consulting firm, the position must be supernumerary. Supernumerary just means temporary. It means what I'm saying, where they're coming to address a specific challenge and then they're leaving. It's not a permanent role at the company. For management consulting firms, again, my example where the McKinsey consultants going from Mexico City to New York City, that can be to fill a permanent role. Say they're filling a permanent management consulting role at McKinsey in New York City. That's fine. Um, so the second category we'll talk about today that is uniquely challenging is the economist category profession. And the reason that that is challenging is completely different from the management consulting category. The economist category is challenging because in November of 2017, the government issued a policy memo that said that it really narrowed the scope of what the government thinks economists do. So if you remember, I recommended the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and we were looking at what an economist does. I'm not going to go through everything again, all of the job duties again, but do Google OOH economist and click on that what they do link, and you'll see the government has a very clear sense of what economists do. What this policy memo said is that what economists do not do is work as financial analysts or market research analysts. So before 2017, people were coming to the US on as TN economists, and they were working as financial analysts who are essentially financial analysts are working for financial institutions to find opportunities to invest money for profit. Market research analysts are really working with their employer to help the company market its products or services. So the government said, we don't want people coming into the US as teen economists doing those two roles. You can also go on OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, and look at market research analysts or financial analysts to get a good sense of what they do and what is not allowed on a TN. So if you are coming to the US as an economist, a TN economist, make sure your job duties are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook, what they say economists do. Make sure you're not doing what it says financial analysts and market research analysts do. If you are looking to come to the US to work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, I would say your options are either consider whether a management consulting role on a TN would work. Again, has to be to address a specific challenge, has to be temporary, will be high risk, but could be approved. Or you might consider other visa options like the H-1B, potentially the O-1, but the TN may be a hard sell if you're trying to do that. All right, we can go to the next slide. I already talked about the process in a general sense. So on this slide, we can just get into a few more details. Again, nationals of Canada do have the option of applying at a port of entry. That could be a land crossing, it could be an airport, but they can apply for the TN at that port of entry. They would present their application materials to the officer, and the officer, if they approve, will then admit the person into the US and TN status, again, typically for 3 years. So what does an application packet look like for a TN visa? Again, it really comes down to what the TN regulations say and how you qualify. So the first thing that a TN application is going to include is a letter from the US employer that describes who the US employer is, why they need someone in this role, who you are as the applicant and how you qualify. And again, that's going to come down to the regulations, whether you have a degree, whether you have a professional license, or you have experience. It's going to get into the job duties you'll actually perform in the US. So the employer letter is going to actually say what you're going to be doing in the US. And again, those job duties need to be aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook, what the government thinks the role should do. You're going to say what you intend. The US employer is going to say what they intend to pay you and for how long, up to 3 years. And the reason we say up to 3 years is, again, you're only admitted into the US for a maximum of 3 years in TN status. In addition to that employer letter, the employer letter, by the way, does need to be signed by the employer, needs to have an original signature if you're applying at a consulate or a port of entry. If you're applying through USCIS, a copy's fine. But in addition to that employer letter, you do need to have original documentation proving how you qualify. So if you're qualifying based on a degree, you actually need to have the original degree with you when you go to the port of entry or to the consulate. Again, USCIS will accept copies. Um, if you're applying based on experience, you need to have letters from past employers with original signatures and the company letterhead, explaining the amount of time you worked for them. Okay, and you need to cover that 5-year period or however much experience you need to qualify. If you're applying based on a professional license, you need to have that original license with you. The reason you need originals is that the ports of entry and the consulates encounter a lot of fraud. So if you do not have originals, they are likely to suspect fraud. They are likely to deny the application. So don't spend all this time only to get to the consulate or the port of entry with a copy and be denied. Just bring the original. Also, if your degree is a related degree, as we talked about before, uh, and you want to bring a transcript, then bring certified copies of the transcript. Make sure that you do have originals or certified copies of the transcript as well. You do, of course, need to bring your passport. And if you're applying with family members, make sure to bring originals showing how you're related to them. So marriage certificates, birth certificates, things like that. Okay, so some ports of entry, we're moving on to the next bullet. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. You can find out which ports of entry these are online on the CBP website, and we're happy to help with that as well. Um, this is recommended for the first application typically, or if you have a complex application, it could be smart to do this. Um, for later entries, you really can enter if you're Canadian through any port of entry, and also nationals of Mexico. If you have that TN visa, you can generally enter through any port of entry. One thing I do want to say, and this applies to both nationals of Mexico and Canada, is the TN can be renewed indefinitely. As long as you continue to qualify, you can, use those 3 years. You continue to be employed. You've done the good work. The U.S. employer wants you to continue working there. You can renew the TN indefinitely. Um, Usually, this is not a problem, and you're not going to be asked about it until, say, year 6, 7 of being on a TN. You might get questions about, do you actually intend to leave the U.S. eventually, or is this a permanent arrangement? It's usually not hard to satisfy the government, that you can renew indefinitely based on the law, and as long as you aren't pursuing a green card, that's probably not going to be a problem. So, again, you do need to remain eligible. You do need to continue doing the job duties that are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook, things like that. But you can renew the TN indefinitely. And while we're on the topic of related aspects of the TN, you can use a TN for part-time work, and you can use a TN to work for more than one TN employer. So let's say that you're hired by an accounting firm to work as an accountant, and they only want you to work for 20 hours a week. And you need to pay your bills. So you get another job offer from another accounting firm, and you want to work for both firms part-time. That is fine on a TN. You can have concurrent TN status. You do need to make sure to be approved for both employers before you start working for that employer. So if you already have a TN for one accounting firm, you're working for that accounting firm, and another accounting firm says, "Hey, you do good work. I want you to work with us." You do need to wait until the government approves that second firm as well, your TN for that second firm, before you start working for them. But it's usually a quite straightforward process. Um, Either applying at a port of entry, a consulate, or USCIS to get that concurrent TN status to work for more than one TN employer. Okay, we already talked about applying at a consulate. Nationals in Mexico who are outside the US must apply at a consulate. Um, if a national of Mexico is inside the US, they have the option of either applying through USCIS or applying at a consulate. They would have to, of course, leave to apply at the consulate, but they can submit that application while they're in the US generally. Um, and then finally, both nationals of Canada and Mexico can apply from within the US. So if they're already here, say on an F1 visa, they want to change to a TN status, then they would file, or their employer would file the I-129 with USCIS with all of the same supporting documents that we talked about before. The employer letter, copies of how the person qualifies. They would send that to USCIS with the form I-129, and then USCIS would give a decision. USCIS does offer an expedited option. I believe it is 15 business days. And I believe the fee that USCIS charges is about $2,800 for that expedited process. But you do have that 2-week option if you're in a hurry. If you don't pay for that option, you are looking at several months before you get a decision from USCIS on that application. So do make sure you maintain um, maintain underlying status while you're waiting for that. Ideally, you would be doing that. Okay, we can move on to the next. What are some common tips and pitfalls? So we already covered a number of these. So it's always a good idea to go on the CBP, Customs and Border Protection website, and call the port of entry you plan to use and just ask them, I'm planning to be at your port of entry next week or to apply for a TN. Are there any specific procedures I need to be aware of? This became much more common to do during the COVID pandemic when procedures would change quite regularly. So it is still a good idea to do it just to make sure you're familiar with you make sure that if you need an appointment, you're scheduling an appointment. And if you don't need an appointment, you just know what the procedure is. It's a good idea. So I mentioned the employer letter and that it needs an original signature on it. It's a good idea to have the person who signed that letter and whose contact information is on the letter to be available by phone at the time of your interview, because sometimes the consular officer or the border officer will call that person just to make sure that the job offer is legitimate. So you might just want to give a heads up to the officer. Hey, I'm going to be at the border tomorrow between 1 and 3 p.m. Around that time. Can you just have your phone on you in case you get a call? They usually don't call, but just in case. We mentioned the importance of originals. If you're applying at a consulate or a port of entry, bring original documentation showing how you qualify, whether that's a diploma, transcripts, signed versions of the employer letter, signed versions of the experience letters, etc. And finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa, and that means it's not a green card. It does not lead to a green card. If you are on a TN visa and you want to pursue a green card, it can be done. It does require a lot of attention to detail, and it does carry risks. So it is recommended that you speak with an attorney, an immigration attorney, to talk through how to navigate that. It can be very tricky, but can be done. Now, I mentioned before the TN can be renewed indefinitely. However, it's always a good idea to have proof of your ties to your home country, whether that's Canada or Mexico, that you have a bank account there, if you have an apartment or a home there, if you have children in school there, family there. It's good to have that documentation with you when you go to the interview just to prove you maintain those ties with your home country. And with that, we can move on to any questions that have come in.
Okay, thank you, Dustin. And that was really helpful and very informative. With that, let's go ahead and take a look at questions from our participants. Okay, Q&A, no questions yet. Okay, we don't see any questions. That's good. Okay. If you guys have any other questions, you can always contact us and then make a consultation appointment. Okay. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope this webinar has been helpful and informative. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to visit our website and schedule a consultation with our team. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.